I'm not happy with the European Union, I want to tell you. And,
Will you put tariffs
and
on
we're going to
cars?
win that. We're going to win that financial battle.
Now, in the midst of international trade conflicts, the world is experiencing an economic storm that could change the global market. A few days ago, Donald Trump, in his second cadence, again went to escalate trade relations. He promised to bring America back to the old days of economic prosperity. But what is really behind his decision? What are the dangers of this new wave of tariffs, and how will it affect your life? Watch as the economic giant loses its footing and $1.2 trillion disappears from American markets.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States.
What is behind such drastic measures? The answer is tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and agricultural products, which at first glance seem like just part of a grand strategy. But when the economic interests of not only the US but the entire world are at stake, the consequences can be devastating. Have you ever wondered what could happen if the economy of the world's most powerful country began to falter? A falling stock market, depreciation in the shares of major companies, dramatic fluctuations on the stock exchanges, all because of a decision that initially seemed like an afterthought. Ironically, however, not all defeats go in the U.S.'s favor, and that's where Europe comes into play. In response to Washington's latest actions, the European Union is preparing its own $28 billion retaliation. Who will be in the winning position in this fight? How will Trump defend his strategy, and what's behind it? Populism or a deeply thought-out plan for the future?
Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe, including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs.
These and other questions remain unanswered, but one thing is certain. An economic crisis may be just around the corner. And while the country is experiencing economic instability, the US government says it is not afraid of this storm. But will they be able to deal with the aftermath, or will things turn out to be worse than they expected? In this video, we will understand what is behind the current economic crisis, how international relations affect trade, and what will happen to the world markets if the situation continues in this scenario. Stay tuned for all the details of what's behind these high-profile claims and how it will affect the global economy in the coming months. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the most important updates.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Canada also striking back with new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods, mostly steel and aluminum, but also computers and sporting goods.
Donald Trump's implementation of tariff policies, with his ambitious goal of returning America to its former economic power, has already begun to have an impact on the market and international trade relations. When Trump took office as U.S. president in 2016, his statements on tariffs and the protection of American manufacturers were among the main points of his economic program. He argued that the U.S. economy has grown weaker each year due to unequal trade agreements, and that it was time to overhaul the system. Countries such as China, Mexico, and European Union countries represented the main creditors of the U.S. market, benefiting from weak U.S. foreign policy. Trump, on the other hand, claimed that his goal was to return the U.S. to the status of a world leader with a strong economy. He assured that imposing tariffs on Chinese goods and other imports would be the first step toward restoring economic growth. When he signed the executive order imposing the tariffs, expectations were high. Tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, tariffs on automotive components and agricultural products were not only meant to spur American manufacturing, but also to reduce the trade deficit with several key countries. Trump claimed such a decision was necessary to restore the US to its former position in the global economy by limiting its dependence on foreign supplies. But here's what happened. On the surface, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The US economy even showed a slight growth in the first months, but later economists started sounding the alarm. It was at this point that the first signs appeared that Trump's plan could lead to unpredictable consequences.
Tesla is a peaceful company. We've never done anything harmful. I've never done anything harmful. I've only done productive things. So I think we just have a deranged, there's some kind of mental illness thing going on here, because this doesn't make any sense.
It didn't take long for a negative reaction from the US trading partners. Mexico and Canada immediately announced the introduction of counter tariffs on products from the US, and China, in turn, began punitive measures against American goods. As a result, all of these countries responded with similarly harsh measures, causing the US economy to soon begin to face higher prices for imported goods, and US companies working with foreign partners began to feel the impact of these measures. Manufacturers, faced with rising costs of components and materials, began to raise the prices of their products, which in turn negatively impacted consumer activity domestically.
We have accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
He praised all the domestic actions he has taken so far on immigration.
And I deployed the U.S. military and Border Patrol to repel the invasion of our country.
And spending cuts.
We are draining the swamp. It's very simple.
However, the true shock to the financial markets came after the wave of volatility in the stock exchanges began. In the first weeks of March 2025, the U.S. stock market lost more than $1.2 trillion, the largest drop since 2022. This triggered panic among investors and caused the largest loss of value in stock markets since the global financial crisis. In particular, shares of major technology companies such as Tesla, Microsoft, and Amazon fell 15% to 20%, while the Nasdaq index posted its worst performance since 2022. The market was in a tailspin and economists began making alarming predictions. The situation was aggravated by the fact that simultaneously with the introduction of tariffs, the process of shortage of goods in the domestic market began. According to the data, almost 30% of imports to the US were goods from the countries hit by the sanctions. The shortage of key components for industry, as well as the rising prices of imported goods, meant that American businesses faced financial difficulties, leading to job cuts and increased unemployment. In particular, corporations such as General Motors and Ford have announced that they will soon have to cut production and close plants, which has had an immediate impact on the economy. And while until a few months ago, many experts believed that Trump's strategy would be successful, it has now become apparent that his trade war has hampered the path to economic prosperity.
Well, this feels more like a Tesla-only story when you look at just this fall in EV sales for them, that they're suffering across Europe, down 45% in January. The wider EV market in Europe up 37%, so rivals are catching up and performing.
Added to these economic cataclysms were the foreign policy implications. With each passing day, it became clearer that the US stance of escalating relations with key trading partners was hampering not only economic cooperation, but also political engagement. The European Union, initially slow to take action in response to Trump's tariffs, soon began to take its own steps. Initially, the EU expressed displeasure, but over time Europe began to act more decisively, preparing retaliatory economic sanctions in response to US aggression. As the US economy faced a real threat, more and more people began to wonder if Trump's strategy was too risky. How much longer will this economic experiment continue? Many of the world's top economists, including those from the United States, have expressed the view that tax reforms and tariffs cannot be the only tools for the country's economic recovery. Moreover, the growing debt and declining confidence in the American dollar cast doubt on the sustainability of the American financial system.
outperforming as well in some cases, doing better than Tesla. And you just have to think, how much more is this a sustained issue for Tesla going forward, given the fact that you have Elon Musk, who's been very forthright in his opinions, particularly weighing in on politics, particularly in Europe. We've just had the European elections, which Musk has been very focused on. But across the piece, when you look at the performance for Tesla in Europe, it's not just in small countries. There are a lot of countries where Tesla has been performing badly, including in Germany, in the UK, where it has been lagging, and Spain as well.
Meanwhile, the president remained confident that his policies would bear fruit. "We cannot afford to be weak on the international stage," he said, justifying his measures. But the question remained, at what cost? And how soon would this price become tangible for the average citizen? And so, the first contradictions within the government itself began to appear. Some experts and analysts within the administration began to doubt the long-term viability of the strategy, suggesting softer methods of working with trade partners. At the same time, less liberal factions within the president's party began to insist on a hard line. Economists warned that if current policies continued, the US could find itself in an even more precarious position, leading to not only an economic but also a political crisis. Thus, although there were tentative successes, it soon became clear that the American dream based on tariffs and economic isolation might be much more fragile than it had initially appeared. The question no one can answer with certainty is how long the US can sustain such a burden. And if Trump's strategy continues in the same vein, will America not be on the brink of another economic recession?
Tesla shares have slumped by more than 9% amid a fall in sales in Europe. The electric vehicle maker posted lower sales across 5 European countries, including France and the UK. Joining us now to discuss this is CBS News foreign correspondent Remi Inocencio. Remi, why do we believe these sales are dropping? What's driving that?
Sure. Well, Errol, basically what Elon Musk has been talking about over the past, say, few months, ever since Donald Trump's election back to the White House, that has been fueling this anger, this frustration. Some even say disgust towards Musk, and they're taking it out on Tesla. Tesla now feeling the pain. But because of what's happening here in Europe, Tesla sales fell by nearly half across the continent just last month, 45%.
When the US began to face the consequences of the imposed tariffs, it didn't take long for international reactions to follow. Responses from countries such as Canada, China, and European Union countries escalated with each passing month. First and foremost, the actions of China and Europe have clearly demonstrated that Trump's tariff policies could lead to a real trade war. But more alarmingly, the very structure of these trade conflicts jeopardized not only the economic interests of the United States, but also its position in global markets. China, for example, has begun to target US agricultural exports by imposing additional duties on soybeans, corn, and wheat, traditional US commodities that take a weighty share of Chinese imports. As a result, farmers in the States began to lose a stable market, leading to massive bankruptcies and job losses. China was also not shy in its retaliatory measures. In response to the 25% duty on Chinese goods imposed by Trump, Beijing announced 15% additional duties on products from the United States. Moreover, such goods were chosen that would cause maximum damage to American manufacturers. For example, cars and high-tech devices, such as smartphones and computers, began to become more expensive in the Chinese market, which in turn led to lower profits of American companies. This made things difficult for giants such as Apple and Tesla, which were forced to rethink their strategy of operating in China. The European Union has not been left out either. In response to Trump's aggressive tariff policy, the European Commission developed a comprehensive package of countermeasures targeting goods that are of strategic interest to the US. One of the first steps was the threat to impose 50% duties on American goods, including alcohol, motorcycles, and agricultural products. Although such measures remained at the level of threats, their impact on the US market was already tangible. For example, popular brands of American whiskey and beer, which formed the basis of exports to Europe, became more expensive, which led to a drop in their sales. European producers began to fill the niche, and demand for US products dropped dramatically.
That's from the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. People just choosing with their wallets to not buy Teslas because of that Musk-Trump association. And actually here in London, an activist group called Everyone Hates Elon actually have been hacking bus stop signs with posters. I actually passed one yesterday. First, I wasn't quite sure what was happening, but it said the words 0 to 1939 in 3 seconds. Illusion here, 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds or something. But this poster was alluding to the start of World War II, and the image was of Musk giving that hand salute that we saw at Trump's inauguration that many have attacked as a Nazi gesture. Musk, though, has neither admitted or denied what he was doing. But we're seeing the knock-on effect of that anti-Musk anger across Europe and in terms of sales.
However, the European Union went even more drastic when it announced retaliatory tariffs on US cars, steel and aluminum, which created a real storm in the financial markets. For the first time since 1970, economic sanctions between the US and Europe began to threaten not only export industries, but entire industrial sectors. European manufacturers began to accuse Trump of destroying years of partnership, and a real political crisis began on the international stage. Trump's tariffs became a symbol of economic isolation, and this isolation was gradually destroying the foundations of international trade. At the same time, the voices of politicians who began to question the legitimacy of Trump's actions began to be heard in America. Among them was the former US Treasury Secretary, who in an interview said, "We are on the brink of economic disaster if we don't revise these tariffs. This is not a game, but a real struggle for survival on the world stage." His opinion was shared by many experts observing the rapid escalation of the situation. The negative consequences for the US economy, they pointed out, were more than obvious: growing shortages of goods, rising prices, and deteriorating quality of life for citizens. Trump himself, despite harsh domestic and international critics, continued to declare that America will not be tolerated, and that his strategy was aimed at the long-term restoration of the country's economic power. Despite his confidence, however, domestic leverage began to take its toll. More and more business representatives began to express concern about possible debt obligations, rising prices, and job cuts. The rallying of major business associations against the tariffs was a clear signal that the market was losing patience. It was clear to the president that the situation was beginning to spiral out of control. But he could not stop, for to roll back his policies would be to admit defeat in the global trade war. When the US faced economic turmoil in March 2025, more than $1.2 trillion left the market. It was the nation's largest financial crisis since 2008. Markets began to panic, and one of the largest US stock exchanges, the Nasdaq, experienced its worst day in 3 years. That moment became a turning point. On one such day, shares of major technology companies such as Tesla, Google and Amazon crashed by 15%. Tesla was particularly hard hit, whose shares fell 20% in one day, resulting in significant losses for investors and the corporation. The situation jeopardized not only the national economy, but also Trump's reputation as a leader capable of managing the situation. The US economy, facing the consequences of his aggressive trade policy, was in a state of instability, and forecasts made before the tariffs were imposed began to crumble. Independent experts and analysts have begun to claim that Trump's policies have led to increased economic inequality, higher prices for basic goods, and the risk of a deepening recession. A prominent economist from Harvard University wrote in one of his studies, "When the US begins to build a wall of tariffs, that wall does not become a barrier to other countries, it becomes a barrier to its own producers." And this was not just a theoretical conclusion. Its consequences were being felt every day. In parallel, it became apparent that more and more countries, including Canada, Mexico, and Europe, were beginning to put their economic interests ahead of those of the United States. This is due to several factors, chief among them a decline in Musk's credibility and his controversial statements that increasingly overshadowed the company's strategy. At some point, it became clear that the company itself and its shareholders were beginning to experience a crisis. The stock markets panicked, and investors, disoriented by the sharp fluctuations in the stock, began to sell their stakes in Tesla en masse. Even the largest institutional investors, who had once bet on the company as a stable player with huge growth potential, began to reduce their investments. As a result, Tesla started losing huge amounts of money in the stock markets, and its market capitalization dropped by tens of billions of dollars. One of the reasons for this was that Musk was playing his role as a public figure as always. But this time his actions were a source of not only controversy, but also lost confidence among those who had invested in Tesla. Despite several statements that the crisis is temporary and Tesla will get through the difficulties, investors began to doubt that the company will be able to regain its leadership in the market. The market was shocked by Musk's statements when he once again drew parallels between Tesla's future and the company's importance in the perspective of humanity. But instead of regaining investor confidence, these speeches only increased concerns that Musk had lost focus and was more interested in his projects in other areas, such as Twitter and SpaceX. Investors began to question how seriously Musk could stay involved in Tesla when his attention was so often diverted to other areas. This created even more doubts and increased the negative perception of the company. To make matters worse, news of Musk going on extended business trips and his social media mentions that diverted attention away from the business only added fuel to the fire. Some of the major shareholders began publicly stating that Musk should focus on Tesla and stop meddling in the affairs of other companies if he wanted to regain investor confidence and resuscitate his company. Despite this instability, the company still tried to regain lost ground by focusing its efforts on expanding production and cutting costs. However, capacity issues and growing competition, including from Chinese brands, continue to be serious obstacles to recovery. Tesla has been forced to offer discounts on its cars in some regions to support demand, but the moves have raised further questions about the company's long-term strategy. The price cuts, despite rising costs, had a negative impact on profitability, and investors began to further question Tesla's ability to meet its targets. As a result, the company's stock continued to fall despite Musk's repeated attempts to calm the market. However, there are still those who have not given up hope for Tesla's recovery, viewing its problems as temporary. Some analysts believe that this crisis may be followed by a series of strategic maneuvers that will help the company to return to its former positions. For example, perhaps Tesla will decide to invest in new technologies, such as mass-producing cheaper batteries or new car models that can better compete with the growing number of Chinese manufacturers. Others suggest that the company may focus on expanding its network of charging stations and improving its infrastructure, which would give it a competitive advantage in the long run. Reducing Musk's public social media activity could also be an important step, which would improve the company's image and regain the trust of consumers and investors. In addition, Tesla may try to strengthen its position in developing countries such as India, where the electric car market is just starting to develop but already has a high growth potential. Investing in new markets where competition is not yet as strong could give Tesla a chance to rebound, as well as help offset losses in older markets such as Europe and the US. However, despite the possible solutions, Tesla's future remains very much in question. Unless the company can make the necessary changes to its strategy and regain the confidence of shareholders, its future could be in serious jeopardy. In addition, with increasing competition from major manufacturers such as Volkswagen and Chinese brands, the question of Tesla's survivability amid such trials is becoming more and more urgent. Time will tell whether the company will be able to cope with this crisis and regain its leadership in the electric car market, or whether its best days are behind it.